much for joining us tonight. My name is Erin Payton, and I'm the Executive Director of the 19th Century Charitable Association, which is located in Oak Park, Illinois. We have a wonderful program for you tonight called The Statue of Liberty, What It Means Today. And you're going to see some really interesting information that might intrigue you to ask a question. If you do want to ask a question or leave a comment for our presenter, you can do so in the comments field or the Q&A field. And towards the end of the program, we will open up for questions, and I will unmute a couple of you guys if you want to ask them. So be ready to be unmuted when I call your name. Without further ado, I'm going to welcome to the program Diane Moses. Diane Moses is the program chair of the 19th Century, and she's going to give a great introduction to our presenter, Mary Meg McCarthy. Diane?
Thank you very much. Mary Meg McCarthy is the Executive Director of Heartland Alliance's National Immigrant Justice Center, one of the nation's foremost immigrant and human rights advocacy organizations. Working with the pro bono network of 1,500 attorneys, NIJC provides counsel and representation to approximately 10,000 low-income immigrants, refugees, and asylum seekers each year. An expert in immigration law, Mary Meg has testified before Congress and is often quoted in major news outlets such as MSNBC, the New York Times, and the Chicago Tribune. As an active member of the American Bar Association, Mary Meg chairs its Commission on Immigration. Mary Meg McCarthy has been honored with many, many awards. We are delighted to have her. Let's give her a very warm virtual welcome.
Thank you very much, Diane, and thank you, Erin. It's really an honor for me to be with you this evening tonight. Immigration is clearly an issue in the news every day, and I am really honored to contribute to the discussion this evening with some experiences that we have had at the National Immigrant Justice Center. The National Immigrant Justice Center, as Diane mentioned, we provide legal representation to low-income immigrants, refugees, and asylum seekers, as well as advance systemic reform through our impact litigation and advocacy. We're very unique in the country in that respect, and we do it with an outstanding group of pro bono attorneys, some of them from Oak Park. So let me begin tonight with an example. Last week, we received a call from a local hospital asking for urgent help. The father of 2 children, one with leukemia and the other with severe kidney disease, was arrested on his way to work and put in deportation proceedings. We're talking about a father who has been in the US for a decade. He poses no threat to the United States, nor to his community, nor does anyone accuse him of criminal activity. He's not a burden on you or me, and in fact, he has a job and is the primary support for 2 young American children, both of whom have serious health conditions. And yet, if we hadn't intervened, he would have been deported last Friday, and this family would be permanently separated and at risk of becoming indigent. The question I would like to pose to you is why? What compelling interest was served by tearing this family apart? The answer is uncomfortable. There's no fiscal, humanitarian, or criminological reason to prioritize this man's deportation. The federal courts are overwhelmed by similar cases. Resources that could be used to fight violent crime, stem the tide of the pandemic, or help vulnerable populations from sliding into poverty has been diverted into a totally arbitrary and unaccountable war against immigrants. The good news is that it doesn't have to be this way. And in fact, historically, presidents of both parties have used their discretion to protect the integrity of families, even when the immigration laws have targeted particular types of non-citizens and made individual family members vulnerable to deportation. The integrity of the family has always trumped over civil law priorities, and it's not a radical proposition to demand that we return to this core principle. I could stand up here or sit here and express my outrage at the current administration's anti-immigrant policies and the myths and the hatred directed to immigrants and racial minorities right now. Instead, I'd like to make a simpler proposition. The central thread of our current immigration policy, the one thing that all the executive orders, policies, and priorities have in common is the intentional separation of families, breaking apart families as a deterrent to future immigrants. The president didn't create this policy, but he has exploited existing vulnerabilities and dramatically expanded its scope. Well into its fourth year, the current administration has undertaken more than 400 executive actions on immigration. The president has been able to dramatically reshape the U.S. immigration system through regulatory, policy, and executive orders. Congress hasn't passed any laws that have impacted the immigration system. This has all been done through executive action. In fact, the inability of Congress to enact any meaningful legislation on immigration during the past quarter century has left the United States with a long, outdated immigration system that works for very few, leaving the president with enormous influence and control over U.S. immigration policy. Rather than responding to each individual policy in turn, or advocating for some broad but ultimately vague concept of immigration reform, let's begin by establishing and defending a basic right to family integrity. The only way to do this is to strengthen due process and accountability, to make sure that everyone has access to counsel and the public can see what's really going on. For the past 4 years, we have seen the unraveling of human rights, particularly for immigrants. Beginning with the refugee ban, as many of you remember that cold January evening when maybe some of you even went out to the airport to welcome refugees when those doors were being closed and separating families. To current elimination of the immigration system and even not allowing people who secured legal immigration status from entering the country, or attempting to kick out students, foreign students who were residing here and pursuing their academic careers. And I say attempting because that was reversed because of the outcry by American public. Immigrants continue to be a target. The administration has closed the border, and those fleeing human rights abuses and seeking protection in the U.S. have been denied access to our asylum system. And for those working in the U.S., essential workers in the restaurant, healthcare industry, grocery stores, many have been denied financial assistance, including immigrants lawfully here married to U.S. citizens with U.S. citizen children. With that introduction, permit me to review 3 areas of policy where the right to family is currently under threat, precisely because there's a total lack of due process or accountability, and where we could see change with very simple direct measures. The first area is a policy called zero tolerance. The next area I want to talk about is the asylum system. And lastly, I want to talk about executive discretion, particularly relating to Daca, Deferred Action for Childhood Arrivals. The zero tolerance policy. In the spring or summer of 2018, the administration implemented the zero tolerance policy. This policy resulted in the prosecution of every individual who crossed the border, including asylum seekers, many who were entering with their children. This policy resulted in toddlers and children being separated from their parents. In June of 2018, thanks to the public outcry, the administration announced that it would no longer separate families and a federal court ordered the administration to stop this practice. Unfortunately, we continue to see families who are entering this country seeking protection who face separation. At NIJC, the National Immigrant Justice Center, we have seen families who have been separated based on the government's determination that this parent was not fit to be the parent of this child. It wasn't a question of whether or not this was actually the child's parent. Rather, the Department of Homeland Security made a decision as to what is in the child's best interest. We sued the government for separating these families based on alleged findings that this parent was no longer fit to be caring for this child. In one case, our clients, a mother and her 6-year-old son, were separated for months based on the mother allegedly having committed a crime in her home country. When we investigated as to the truth of the criminal allegation, we learned that she was exonerated. Even with this evidence, the government refused to release her and reunite her with her child. Since when has the Department of Homeland Security been the expert as to when a parent is fit? What process exists for the parent to challenge that finding? None, unless that parent has a lawyer willing and able to challenge the finding. And that we did. And I'm pleased to tell you that mother and her son are reunited today. We have also filed a lawsuit on behalf of 5 families who are separated, seeking damages for the infliction of the trauma that is experienced by these families. These cases remain pending, but we hope that these families will be compensated for the harm they suffered, as well as force the government to change its policy and never again separate these families. What is happening today is totally arbitrary. Family separation is not only destroying the families, but destroying our federal criminal system. It undermines due process and is irrational. Let me move on to the second area, asylum and refugee law. Asylum allows people to salvage some semblance of their lives they lost when they had to flee their homes. Under international and US law, migrants seeking asylum are entitled to due process like US citizens. Our asylum system was created post-World War II pursuant to the UN Convention on Refugees and the 1980 Refugee Act. Under US law, seeking asylum are entitled to an attorney at their own expense, and immigration judges are required to explain to them their rights. We had a system. It was far from perfect, but it was a system with a process that provided for legal representation, allowed for appeals, and that handled thousands of cases annually. Today, that process is being destroyed and hollowed out to nothing more than a deportation assembly line. Today, in a fundamentally transformed US asylum system, new policies and procedures have created an invisible wall of bureaucracy and secrecy that has made accessing asylum protection almost impossible. Asylum seekers are also now subject to negative case law issued by the Attorneys General and the Board of Immigration Appeals that purport to establish certain limitations to who is entitled to asylum. This specifically impacts individuals who are seeking asylum based on gender, domestic violence, family membership, and land ownership. I would argue that the administration is ignoring the 1980 Refugee Act. Asylum process is not a loophole. Anyone who thinks it's a loophole has never been in immigration court or prepared 2,000 pages of documentation to prove that my client is at risk of persecution. These are extremely detailed reports, paperwork that would pass forensic examination, testimony before a prosecutor. That is a successful case. it is a highly contested process where the whole burden of proof is on the asylum seeker herself. And if in jail with limited English skills, trying to put this material together with no access to attorneys or the evidence makes it nearly impossible to meet this burden of proof, particularly in front of a seasoned federal prosecutor who is trying to poke holes in her case. In the past year, the administration has issued executive orders to prohibit asylum seekers from even entering the country to apply for asylum. As a result of the crisis at our border manufactured by the administration policies, we are seeing people at the border who are suffering, waiting to secure an opportunity to present their asylum case. Beginning with the Migration Protection Protocols, MPP, known as Remain in Mexico, we are seeing asylum seekers on the border waiting to return to the United States to apply for asylum. Before the pandemic, there were approximately 60,000 people in Mexico waiting for their asylum hearing in the US, in tents called courtrooms along the border. Since the pandemic, these cases have been put on pause, and these families are waiting in Mexico, some in very, very dangerous situations. They are facing the pandemic, violence, kidnapping, sexual assault, and danger from the drug cartels, human traffickers, and criminal gangs. Women and children are particularly at risk. We know this is true because it has happened to our clients. Last winter, a pair of cousins traveled by bus because it has happened, a pair of cousins traveled by bus from another part of Mexico to Laredo, where they had their court hearing in Nuevo Laredo. As one cousin disembarked from the bus, he was abducted by waiting cartels. The other cousin managed to escape. At the next day in Texas, despite the remaining cousin's eyewitness that her cousin had been taken, the US government attorney argued strenuously that the missing cousin should be ordered deported for failing to appear. We vehemently fought that argument, and we prevailed. And eventually, the other cousin was released by the kidnappers and reunited with the other cousin, and they're now waiting for their hearing in Texas. But they remain in Mexico, but the hearing itself will take place once the courts open again in Texas. In addition to the Remain in Mexico executive order, there have been 3 other executive orders the administration has sought to implement to ban individuals from seeking asylum in the US. The first one was denying people access to asylum if they entered outside the port of entry. The second one required people to apply for asylum in the country in which they traveled. And many of these individuals are traveling through countries in Central America where people are fleeing because of the situation and the danger in those countries. So to expect them to apply for asylum in those countries makes absolutely no sense. And 3, the third executive order is being denied asylum in the United States without a hearing and being sent back to the country where the US has entered into agreements called the Asylum Cooperative Agreement. And that, through those agreements, these individuals have to seek asylum in that country. And these are mainly Guatemala and El Salvador. And then most recently, the government has closed the asylum process using the pandemic as an excuse, claiming it was a national security issue. Again, a pandemic should not close our borders. A pandemic should, yes, allow us to take certain steps to ensure everyone's safety and take into consideration public health issues. But it's not a reason and a ground for a complete closure, a blanket closure of our border. All these bans and all these policies have been challenged in the courts, I should say, some with positive results. But the reality remains that asylum seekers are being denied access to protection in the United States today. This is impacting particularly families from Central America, where we've seen a growing human rights crisis. Families are fleeing violence, political persecution, and economic desperation so unimaginable that they take these risks to an all-out effort to survive. 75% of all the asylum seekers in the past 5 years are from Mexico, Guatemala, El Salvador, and Honduras. As the Somali poet Rashad Shear explains, no one leaves home unless home is the mouth of a shark. And no parent puts their children alone in a boat unless the water is safer than the land. Today, the long journey for large numbers of Central American asylum seekers arriving at our southern border is trauma-filled, 2,000-mile shark-filled gauntlet. They arrive now only to discover that our border is closed, and I would argue, without any lawful basis. Let me talk now in the third area, and this is about the executive authority. Every president since Eisenhower has used executive action to uphold long-term principles rather than to play to the prejudices of the moment. They have used their authority to address a pressing emergency or to keep families together. Historically, executive action has been used to correct where the law does not protect vulnerable populations, including families and refugees. Presidents Reagan and Bush exercised executive action to respond to immigration laws that created new opportunities for some members of families, but made others more vulnerable to deportation. Without hesitation, both of these presidents, by executive action, expanded these opportunities so that all members of the nuclear families could remain together. They were committed to protecting the integrity of families. I would now like to shift our conversation to hear what happens if we have an immigration system that recognizes the value of keeping families together and respects individuals. A great example is deferred action for childhood arrivals, what is known as Daca. President Obama used his executive authority to protect dreamers via the Daca program. Daca provides protection for 2 years. Well, now it's for 1 year, which is, we'll talk later about that. But initially it was for 2 years. And it allowed individuals to come out of the shadows. President Obama created this program in 2012, and President Trump rescinded it in 2018. We fought the rescission, and this June, the Supreme Court upheld the Daca program. This program has been praised by some as an overdue action. We have to help these families. We have to help these young people. That is particularly true when we have this congressional stalemate. However, as you know, and as I mentioned, it's been the subject of major legal challenges and has been criticized as presidential overreach. We continue to fight, even though we won at the Supreme Court. And I will tell you a little bit more about that. But let me tell you what we have learned about through the Daca program. And what will hear is when you give people a chance, they thrive. They secure driver's license, they attend schools, they make extraordinary contributions to our communities. I would now like to introduce you to one of our amazing clients, an outstanding member of our community, Carla Robles, who will share her story with you today.
Good evening. My name is Carla Robles, and 2 years ago, I graduated from Loyola University of Chicago where I studied secondary education and Spanish. Today, I am starting my second year as a high school Spanish teacher and tennis coach at Palatine High School. Outside of being a Spanish teacher, I am also one of the 800,000 people who benefited from Daca, and today I would like to share my story with you. I apologize for not being there live with you, but I am coming to you live from my classroom, and I thank you for welcoming me into your space and taking the time to listen to my story. I hope that you are able to take something from it today. I was born in San Luis Potosí, Mexico, and moved to the United States with my family when I was 8 years old. It was in 2004 that my mom, my two older brothers, and I took a flight from Mexico to the United States with travel visas. And a few months later, those visas expired and we became undocumented immigrants. I began understanding more about the title of ours when I was in 6th grade. However, I didn't really have to avoid any questions until I got to junior high. More often than expected, my peers would follow up me saying that I was born in Mexico with the question, so are you legal? At the moment, I knew that this was the one question I had to avoid, so I quickly answered with something like, yeah, I think I'm a citizen or a resident, but I don't really know how the process works, and try to move into something that was a little more appropriate for 12 and 13-year-olds, such as our lunch or something. However, it's quite sad to look back into those times and realize that that was the first question that came into their minds after I told them that fun fact about myself. Despite the legal question, I knew that I had bigger things to worry about. My parents risked everything to make sure that my brothers and I could have a life with more opportunities that we could not access in Mexico. My mom had always told my brothers and me, no matter what, do well in school and stay out of trouble. One day it will pay off. So that's exactly what we did. Through my family's support and motivation, I was focused on persevering and never lost hope. I began developing my passions in this country like any other American child. In fact, in 8th grade, I was given the American Legion Award, an award granted to 2 students from the graduating class who show exemplary American traits and show academic standing and community involvement. Little did they know, they had just given that American award to the student who was far from it in the eyes of the government. But I happily accepted the award, stood in the front of the stage, and moved on with my big secret and my mother's advice. 2 years later, I was at home when my mom rushed home and said, "Hurry up, we're going to church." She looked really upset, so I didn't ask any questions and I just went with her. When we got to church, I remember seeing her and she was still crying, but I didn't know why. It wasn't until we got home that she told me that my 2 older brothers had been detained by immigration officers on their way to visit a friend at Harvard University, and they could be deported. The local detention center was at capacity, so my brothers were sent to the local county jail. That was the moment I decided I could no longer continue with the big secret because my story, my passions, and my wishes to be an educator were not a crime, and no one could share my story better than myself. My brothers had been and continue to be 2 of my biggest role models. So I quickly reflected on the fact that our story was only one of 11 million in this country, and decided that sharing my story could help raise awareness about undocumented immigrants that was often misrepresented on the media. From that point on, my brothers and I have shared our stories in hopes to see a comprehensive immigration reform. We were fortunate enough to have the help of NIJC, who represented them in court and was able to fight for them to receive deferred action and stay in the United States. Although I had no status at that point, I was happy to know that my family would be united and that my brothers could continue to live in the United States. My family will always be grateful for all of the work and the efforts put forth by NIJC to keep our family together. Today, I still have Daca status and feel blessed to have been able to renew my status prior to Trump's attacks. As my life continues to evolve, I have reflected on how much my life has changed and the opportunities that I have had because of Daca. 9 years ago, my mom picked me up from high school tennis practice, and my brother called me telling me that President Obama had just passed deferred action for childhood arrivals, meaning that I would be able to get a license, a job, and be eligible for some private scholarships to pursue higher education. Through Daca, I was able to live without the fear of deportation, get a driver's license, fulfill a year as an AmeriCorps Vista at an elementary school, intern at Senator Durbin's office in D.C., and it is through Daca that I am able to work as a high school Spanish teacher today. As the controversial immigration subject continues to be debated by the government and people all over the country, I am now fighting for not just myself and my family, but also my students and their families. As a graduate from Palatine High School, I have been able to share my story with them, provide support, and encourage them to continue having hope. It has been clear to me that presence is what creates opportunities and leads to generational impacts and systemic change. So I ask you to support undocumented students in any way that you can to propel their success despite the obstacles presented. Scholarships and professional opportunities such as internships are pivotal, yet currently quite scarce for undocumented students. Today, we stand in a political climate that is continuously trying to further divide and attack marginalized communities, including my family, despite all of our supports and achievements. With that being said, I would like to place a call for action to realize that in this environment, our political choices have direct impact into our lives. We cannot vote for people who are actively against providing work authorization for undocumented students or trying to separate their families. We are at a crossroads to show true courage and stand up for our communities and those around us. Thank you for taking the time to listen to my remarks. I'm hopeful that in this new decade, we can move immigration legislation forward and in a direction that provides equitable protection to the millions of immigrants residing and contributing to this country. Thank you once again. Have a great night.
Thank you, Carla. And thank all of you for listening to Carla, who just is such an amazing example of our neighbors, our brothers and sisters, the people in our communities who are making these extraordinary contributions under such a difficult time in our country. I echo what Carla said. We need to do something. And now more than ever, I invite all of you to join us. Let me give you 3 specific things you can do. 1, we need to advocate for basic fairness in our systems. We have an expectation of the law that it will be applied fairly. But how is it fair that Carla's 2 brothers, stellar students, who are going to be facing an immigration judge and an experienced prosecutor alone without an attorney? How would they have ever argued their case? This is a common experience, even for 3-year-olds, to be in an immigration system where people face banishment and sometimes torture and murder, have no right to bail, a jury trial, or court-appointed counsel, and who can be detained indefinitely and separated from their families and have scant opportunity for judicial review. We need to ensure that immigrants, whether new arrivals or those who have lived, worked, and raised their families in the US for many years, have legal counsel. 37% of immigrants have access to counsel. Only 14% of detained immigrants, such as the father I mentioned earlier, and Carla's 2 brothers, have counsel. Immigrants who are not detained and have attorneys are 5 times more likely to pursue relief and nearly 5 times more likely to win their cases than those without attorneys. For detained immigrants, this disparity is even graver. With legal counsel, detained immigrants are 11 times more likely to be able to seek a defense to deportation and twice as likely to win their cases. We are challenged to make our system fair, to ensure that the rule of law is upheld for all individuals, that we don't have a 2-tiered system of justice in our country, but rather it's the system of justice for all individuals. 2, we need to stay informed and change the narrative. Today's immigration narrative that criminalizes immigrants, asylum seekers crossing the border, seeking protection, seeking access to our laws, is plain wrong. immigrants who are here seeking protection, a protection that our law provides, are not criminals. They are human beings who have fled danger and are seeking safety in our country. We have the obligation to change this narrative, to talk to people about immigrants, about asylum seekers, about their contributions, about the need for our country to be a safe haven, to welcome the huddled masses. Lastly, we need a new vision of immigration, one that lives up to the words of the Statute of Liberty. We need immigration reform. We need Congress, we need the administration to act, to welcome our brothers and sisters. Give me your tired, your poor, your huddled masses yearning to breathe free, the wretched refuse of your teeming shore. Send these, the homeless, the tempest tossed to me. I lift my lamp besides the golden door. Emma Lazarus. If we don't welcome the refugee or our neighbors, who will? Let us uphold due process, the cornerstone of the law that impacts all of us, U.S. citizens as well as refugees, immigrants, and undocumented individuals. It is critical to our democracy. Thank you very much.
Thank you very, very much, Mary Meg. How inspiring. And thank you also to Carla. Can you hear me?
Yes.
I just have a couple of real quick questions. What are you the most proud of so far in your work? What are you most proud of?
That's an interesting question.
Thank you.
You know, I think I am most proud of our clients like Carla and so many others who have really demonstrated what is so rich and wonderful about this country. Carla is just one example. The father of those two children that I talked about earlier, the cousins who are still in Mexico, the resilience, the courage, the contributions that they make to our country are just really, and the sacrifices they make are really inspiring.
Thank you.
I'm proud of a wonderful, wonderful team of attorneys, both in-house at the National Immigrant Justice Center, as well as our pro bono attorneys. We could never do what we do without our pro bono attorneys. We're a staff of 125, but we provide legal counsel to over 10,000 individuals a year.
I just have one more question. What made you decide to become an attorney in the first place?
Interesting question. I lived and worked in Chile under the Pinochet dictatorship. So and now showing my age, but I lived in an environment where there were no civil and political rights, and that impacted social and economic rights, where the courthouse doors were closed to individuals, where there was no due process or rule of law. And living and working in that environment where I walked around with my American passport because I could have disappeared, right? It just opened my eyes to the importance of fighting for justice. And I think there's many ways to fight for justice. You don't have to be a lawyer, but I did select that path. And I am very grateful for the opportunity to work at the National Immigrant Justice Center and serve as the executive director. We have a wonderful team. We have a wonderful board. We have a wonderful group of pro bono attorneys that are inspirational, and it's a transformative experience.
Great. Thank you for your work and your presentation. And I'm sure people probably have a lot of questions. Thank you.
Thank you.
There, I'm back. Well, I might have had a few tears during that presentation. So you definitely moved me, and I'm sure you moved, like Diane said, quite a few people. We do have some questions, and the first one I'm going to ask to provide their question is Susan Roberts.
Yeah, the question I asked, and I don't think it's really clear, is there no way that, well, I'll put it another way, why don't these children apply for citizenship?
Oh, that's a really good question. The problem is there's no process for them to do that. The laws are so broken that there's no way for these children to even apply to get in line to become a US citizen. And so that's what the DREAM Act was trying to do back in 2012 and years prior, where there was a real movement by the young people themselves. I have to recognize them. I mean, they were called the Dreamers, right? Who were pushing for Congress to pass a law that would allow them to become lawful here in the United States and eventually become US citizens. But right now, the laws don't provide that path. So they're in this temporary status.
Awesome, thank you. And it can feel like running in a hamster wheel. I know for some of my friends who are in that situation. We are gonna get a question from Mary Ellen Lesniak.
Thank you so much, Mary. I mean, I worked in ESL, and all of the years that I worked in ESL, I had many students who were arrested for minor traffic stops and then became part of a process to deport them. Some cases ended happy and some did not end happy. But I heard today that President Trump signed another executive order that could further eliminate Daca, wiping Daca out, and also put people who have some legal residency at risk. Do you know anything about that, or?
Well, I know that DACA decision from the Supreme Court, and I meant to mention this earlier, is at risk. The government, the administration can go back and try to rescind DACA again. What they have done, which has been really punitive, and I mentioned this very briefly in my remarks, is they have, instead of giving people 2 years deferred action, they've said it's only good for 1 year and you have to reapply. And that's a very expensive endeavor. It's like $495 each time. So now you have to apply every year as opposed to having a 2-year status, which, as you can imagine, for someone like Carla, you have to do and do it timely so you don't lose your job. Because the only way you get your work authorization is if you have DACA. The other thing that's happened with the administration relating to the DACA decision by the Supreme Court, which is being challenged now in the courts, is when that decision came down, our interpretation was that individuals who were not eligible at the time that the president rescinded it in 2018, but then became eligible, are now eligible to apply for DACA. So people who have never applied for DACA because they were not eligible before, under that Supreme Court decision, we have argued that they are now eligible to apply. And the administration is opposing that. In fact, every time we have filed those applications for individuals, they've rejected them. And that's what we are challenging now in the courts, is that interpretation. In terms of legal residence, I'm trying to think of, I don't know if I've seen that specifically today. I think what I did see is that the administration is trying to end what's called temporary protected status, which impacts Salvadorans, Hondurans, Haitians, and I think those are the three major countries. There may be another country too that I'm forgetting. And these are individuals who've been here for years under this temporary status. And TPS, as it's known, provides for some protection for individuals due to natural disaster. And again, it's an executive order. So Hondurans, when they had the terrible, terrible earthquakes, those who resided here, they gave them what's called TPS. And similar to Salvadorans and Haitians with the earthquake. These individuals have been here for years because that status has been continued. They have families, they have US citizen children, they're married, they have jobs, they have legal status, but it's temporary. And the administration announced a couple years ago that they were ending it. And that's been challenged in the courts. And today, we won at the district court level, but today I heard that the Circuit Court of Appeals, the Ninth Circuit, has reversed that win. So those individuals will now be at risk. I don't think the time for that to be implemented is until January. So we have some time to continue to fight that battle, or again, to force the president to extend it. And again, as I mentioned earlier, the president has a lot of authority and power in terms of how immigration law and policy is being implemented, or to get congressional intervention. And so there are some bills, legislation that's been introduced and I think will continue to be advocated for. But Congress is at such a stalemate right now. I don't think that's a viable option, unfortunately.
Wow, that is very complicated. All right, Diane Stevenson, this is a great question. So I am unmuting you.
Okay, I'm here. Thank you so much, Mary Meg, and thanks to Carla too. You've really helped make this issue, I think, come really alive to us here today. I think you said 75% of asylum seekers are from Central America or of Central and South America. I'm wondering about asylum seekers from the Middle East or from Africa. Are there special circumstances regarding their situation, or people from, for example, Syria or Iraq who might want to seek asylum in the United States?
Yes, and we have historically seen a large number of Africans and individuals from the Middle East. Historically, I would estimate especially Syrians would come through the refugee process, which I really didn't talk about much this evening. But the refugee process is different from the asylum process is in that a refugee is identified as meeting the international and US definition of a refugee, an individual who is fleeing persecution based on race, religion, nationality, membership in a particular social group or political opinion. And that individual is identified outside the United States as a refugee. And processed and comes into the country with refugee status, with legal status. An asylum seeker is an individual who comes into the country without having been identified as meeting that definition of a refugee. And so that's what I talked about, the process in the immigration court system. That's what those individuals have to go through to demonstrate and prove that they meet the definition of a refugee. What's happened under this administration, when President Obama left office, every September, end of September, the president, the executive branch has authority to determine how many refugees we will accept that year. In 2016, September 2016, President Obama determined, or his executive branch, State Department, Department of Homeland Security, made a determination that we would accept 110,000 refugees. And many of them would have been from Syria or Iraq, because there's a whole processing centers that in the Middle Eastern countries that would process those individuals. And there were some cases also from Central America too. They did have a Central American program under the prior administration. With this administration, this year, the number of refugees that will be accepted or could be accepted is 18,000. So we went from 110,000 to 18,000. And that program that was created for Central Americans was terminated. So we still see Middle Eastern cases, we still see African cases. We just won a Cameroonian asylum case a couple of weeks ago, but they're a much lower number.
Can you say why, what was the rationale for lowering the number so greatly? Because I've definitely heard some story, like I've read articles and I've listened to some pieces on it, but I just want to hear from an expert.
Yeah, well, I mean, I think there's a lot of concern about religious discrimination. A lot of them were Muslims. But it was cloaked in a national security argument.
Okay.
And that we couldn't process them. And this is, you know, pre-pandemic, had nothing to do with the pandemic.
Right.
It really connected with the Muslim ban, right? That was just like continued into our whole refugee processing system. And it's a tragedy because we have the highest number of refugees in the world today since World War II. And yet the country has really failed to respond to that need. And we have the capacity, and there's evidence and documentation that demonstrates that refugees, just like asylum seekers and immigrants, have made incredible contributions to our economy and to our well-being in our country. And yet we're denying them protection.
And from what I understand, the background process for refugees is pretty elaborate. Extensive.
People go through background checks with the FBI, with kind of the international, I forget the name of it, but you know, there's a whole processing of people to make sure that they're safe, they're secure. I mean, it is unbelievable what people have to go through before they can get into the country. So you have Department of Justice, Department of Homeland Security, and State Department. They have to go through all those checks before anyone is allowed in, and they have to clear that. And it has to be in a very short period of time of them traveling too. So what happened is, especially in 2017 with the Muslim ban, a lot of people had those clearances and then they expired. And those are families, they're waiting to be reunited with their children or with their parents, and now they're stuck. It's just heartbreaking. The bureaucracy has just put everything has halted everything.
Speaking of that, so this is a good, you're making my segues really easy, Mary Meg. I have a question from Susan Kelty. Sue?
My question is, assuming Trump does not get reelected, we can only hope, how easy is it to reverse those executive orders?
That's a really good question. It's not going to be as easy as we'd like. I'll say that much. It's going to take a lot of work. And I think our best avenue, most likely, is going to be through the courts. As I said, you know, we're involved in litigation of these 3 asylum bans, and we're hoping that those cases are just going to go away. Like this policy of not giving people access to the asylum process, we hope that will be over, and those cases will be dismissed. The government will say, we're just going to voluntarily dismiss it. We'll voluntarily dismiss it, and those protections will be available again. I think there's going to be other areas of the law that are the policies that are going to be a lot more difficult to reverse and will take a lot more time, because you have to go through a whole process. And there is some law, which I'm not totally clear on, that says once a regulation has passed, you can't just immediately reverse it. So, and a lot of this has been done. I mean, it's really interesting because first of all, the administration comes out and says, okay, we have this policy memo. We're going to, you know, we're going to require that individuals, that's a good example. We're going to require that the immigration judge hear all the cases immediately and that there's no continuances granted. So that's the policy memo. And then they issue a regulation that says the same thing. And that becomes more the force of law, right? And then we go into court and say that's illegal. We challenge that. And we in fact, we won that where the Seventh Circuit said, look, you can't end administrative closure. The judges should have that right to administratively close a case if that person is pursuing other type of relief. But you just see how they keep layering on the different, what am I thinking of? The different tools that they have to implement these really harsh policies.
They just keep adding padlocks on.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. And it's gonna be a lot of work to reverse them, and it'll probably take more than 4 years. What I hope is that we at least see Congress act so that people like Carla and her family and her brothers and others like them can all have a path, as someone asked, to become lawful in this country. They're making incredible contributions, and we need some type of process and some laws that allow them to do that.
So another perfect segue to my final question. You know, with so much of the debate going on back and forth, you know, there's people on this side, there's people on this side, there's people on this side, and right in the middle. Everyone has an opinion, or I guess the biggest argument is that no one has an answer. Like, what is the solution for this? So I guess based on your immeasurable experience, is there a place that the audience can look? Is there a website that gives what you think is the best answer to how to, I mean, I don't think there's a solution
Right.
for this, but where they can maybe read a little bit more on what could be the path to forward?
Yes. I think, you know, one of the points of my remarks was that we have to have some basic principles and guidelines in terms of what we're going to see in the future in terms of our laws. And what I was arguing tonight is we need to have the family integrity as being a principle. But we also have to have due process. We have to have a system that's accountable to the American public, that's transparent. And so I think those guiding principles are really important. We shouldn't be detaining asylum seekers or families, or like, there's another way to treat people. And this enforcement operation that is like an immediate deportation machinery has to change. So our website, immigrantjustice.org, we have some principles outlined.
Okay.
As to what we would argue should be those basic humane principles that ensure people's human rights are protected and upheld. But there's other really good websites. The American Immigration Council is another. I don't know offhand what their WW title is, but
search it.
Another one, yeah. And I also I don't think the ACLU has anything, but American Immigration Council, American Immigration Lawyers Association. But I think our website, immigrantjustice.org, has those really clear guiding principles. And we'll see what happens. I mean, my colleagues in DC are working with other colleagues to begin to set some principles that we hope will advance meaningful reform that will be fair and ensure the basic principles of our democracy are upheld. One other website I just thought of, the Center for American Progress, may also have some information too.
Well, I just can't thank you enough, both for being here tonight and then just for everything you're doing today and throughout your whole career. You're just pretty wonderful, and you make me want to read some books. Up my brain power a little bit. So thank you so much. Can everybody just give one last silent applause for Mary Meg McCarthy, and have a wonderful evening, Mary Meg. Thank you so much.
I might just add, when you mentioned books, we do have like an ambassador toolkit on our website for books, movies that people might want to watch or share with their book clubs.
And those are so helpful right now because they're very approachable. I've been seeing a lot of those toolkits, and they're very approachable. They're not like a, why haven't you? It's more of like a, hey, why not get started? And I think those are really a nice way to do that.
Right.
So thank you so much.
Okay.
This was a wonderful program. Thank you all so much for attending. If you like this program, we want to keep doing them. So you can always go on our website, www.19thcentury.org, and you can make a donation. And that will allow us to continue these amazing programs in Zoom. Our regular program season does start October 5th. And that will be our Monday programs at 1:30. So just keep an eye on our website for all of the amazing programs we have coming up. So for the 19th Century Charitable Association, this is Erin Payton, and I want to thank you so much for attending tonight. Have a wonderful evening.